for this country is for an even stronger Australia.
On today's World Insight with Tian Wei, a new Prime Minister and Cabinet after a conflict with Australia's ruling party, a one-off or new normal in Australian politics. And Arab states cash in on the Belt and Road Initiative.
It is being supported fully by Arab countries.
Something the Secretary General of the Arab League talked about at length in an exclusive interview. Hello and welcome to World Insight with me, Tian Wei. The program is coming to you live from Beijing on CGTN. We start today's program in Australia. The cabinet of new Australian Prime Minister Scott Morrison were sworn in on Tuesday. Morrison took office last week after his predecessor Malcolm Turnbull was ousted in a leadership challenge within their own ruling party. Whether the new government could bring political stability to the country remains, as always, a big question.
I, Scott John Morrison, do swear that I will well and truly serve the people of Australia in the office of Prime Minister, and that I will be faithful and bear true allegiance to Her Majesty Queen Elizabeth II, Queen of Australia, so help me God.
5 governments in 5 years. Australia has been struggling with shifts in leadership. Again, another Australian Prime Minister ousted within his own ruling party. Mr. Turnbull explained what happened in his own words.
I think you all know what's happened. There was a determined insurgency from a number of people, both in the party room and sort of backed by voices, powerful voices in the media, really to bring, if not bring down the government, certainly bring down my prime ministership. It was extraordinary. It was described as madness by many, and I think it's difficult to describe it in any other way.
Turnbull has decided to quit politics after being forced to step down as Prime Minister, but his challenger, Peter Dutton, a former Cabinet Minister, lost the leadership to Scott Morrison, who was handpicked by Turnbull as Treasurer. After being elected as the new leader, Morrison talked about plans for Australia.
Our plan, my plan for this country, is for an even stronger Australia. To keep our economy strong, to guarantee the essentials that Australians rely on. To keep Australians safe from terrorism and all the way to bullying in our schools. To keep our country together. To not pit one group of Australians against another. To ensure that one can succeed and all can succeed. That one doesn't have to fail for another one to succeed.
Australian political analysts say Turnbull was hard-pressed in defending his leadership, but the new Prime Minister also has to deal with a list of tough challenges, including repairing bruised relations with China left by his predecessor.
For more on Australian politics and what does it mean for the Asia-Pacific region, with us in our Beijing studio, Einar Tangen, current affairs commentator. Sir, welcome to our program. In Perth, Australia, very deep at night in the hour, Mark Vinson. Thank you so much, sir, a professor of international politics at the University of Western Australia. Thank you for being with us. And he is also the founding editor of Critical Studies of Asia Pacific. I want to start with you, Professor Bisson, helping us to understand some of the major challenges the new administration, once coming into power, has to handle. First of all, relations between the United States and China. How will Australia make that fine balance? Has it done well over the past few administrations?
I think it's been an ongoing problem in many ways, and no government in Australia is going to find balancing that relationship and those sets of different imperatives that are economic and strategic. It's not going to be an easy challenge for any government. But I think the point to recognise is, and I think this is pretty well understood in Australia, is that Australia relies heavily on China for its economic well-being. there's no choice other than to get on well with China as far as Australian policymakers are concerned. And I think that point's been recognised and acted upon now for some time. But it's equally true that no government in Australia is going to think seriously about downgrading the strategic relationship with the United States, because for the last 50 or 60 years or so, that's been the notional foundation of Australia's security. And I think it's just inconceivable that any Australian administration is going to think about doing anything that's going to really change that underlying strategic reality.
Inconceivable, that is the adjective Professor Beeson used. However, Mr. Tangen, being an American, now living in China for a long time, this administration in Washington is absolutely unique, and the credibility has been one issue. How do you see the Australian current administration is likely to have the consensus to work with Washington, let's just say, for politics and geopolitics?
Well, quite frankly, it's not much of a change. I mean, this is why the Australian voters are a little taken aback. In terms of working with the United States, I agree that that has always been the past marker. There have been articles that said that Australia needs to develop its own foreign policy instead of just following blindly where the U.S. goes. But with Donald Trump championing a go-it-alone, America, me first kind of situation, it's quite possible that Australia will be forced to make decisions in its economic best interest, which put in balance its relationship with the U.S.
Professor Beeson, it seems that something are already happening. For example, TPP, Trans-Pacific Partnership, U.S. withdrawal. Australia wants, at least during the last administration, to be a sole supporter still of that mechanism. And also China's role, whether or not involved in TPP for the future, is still unknown. Professor Beeson, about trade, this could be one of the most crucial areas and one of the crucial times that you are facing as Australia dealing with the United States.
No, indeed, it's problematic, and I don't think anybody in Australia is under any illusion about how difficult the Trump administration is making Australia's economic relationships, not just with China, but with the region more generally. And I think a lot of people in Australia were very disappointed, especially economic analysts and policymakers. They were very disappointed about the fact that the Trump administration did walk away from the TPP after not only Australia but Japan as well invested a lot of time and political capital in trying to make the TPP agreement work. And many people think that the principal beneficiary of that agreement was actually the United States itself, but it's a reality that the Trump administration doesn't seem to quite appreciate how the international trading system actually works in many ways, and that's another issue that's causing concern in Australia. However, having said all of that, I think the striking thing is that despite the damage that the Trump administration is arguably doing to Australia's national economic interest, there's no appetite in Australia to jeopardize the security relationship with the United States, despite the fact that it's being run by the Trump administration, and as your other guest suggests, it's about America first.
But also, Professor, if you could briefly help us to understand that, now TPP, will Australia still continue to be a polar of that scenario? Will Australia, as a result, seek a very different path about trade compared to its longtime ally, the United States, once the trade relationship has changed, which could be quite fundamental also in the bilateral relationship with Washington? What would that mean for Australia's own role in the region? Professor Beeson, briefly.
Well, I think Australia's been a long-term champion of multilateral trade negotiations and trade liberalisation, and in some ways they have to be, because Australia's a very trade-dependent economy and it doesn't have much chance to compel other countries to behave as they might like them to. So they rely on a rules-based international order, and the Australian government in its foreign policy white paper recently made a great deal attached a great deal of importance to maintaining the rules-based international order and trying to encourage other more powerful states like the United States and indeed like China to follow those rules, because it's in Australia's interest to do so.
But on the other hand, when talking about China, Mr. Tangen, we also have been seeing Australian government, for example, has been blocking China's companies such as Huawei Technologies from coming into the market of 5G in Australia. That seems to be in line with the decision coming from the Trump administration in the United States. So, Mr. Tangen, whether Australia is close with the United States on trade, it's a big question mark. But obviously, when it comes to new technologies and also trade at a different level, it seems that Australia is also hesitating about its relationship with China. So it seems that it's pretty much caught in between, as some say, Mr. Tangen.
Well, at some point they need to make not a choice, but to change the balance of what they have. I mean, blindly following the U.S. lead on not only Huawei, but ZTE, and declaring them basically security risks is not going to change, help the narrative with Beijing. You're basically buying into this idea that somehow China is a strategic, economic, and military competitor. There has to be a change to that. Otherwise, there will be changes made. I mean, the existing world order is changing, including the economic one. Both China and the U.S. are looking for other markets to solve the issues of their tariffs against each other, started by Donald Trump. And unfortunately for Australia, at some point, it needs to figure out where it stands.
Right. Professor Beeson, about that too, you see at WTO, China and the United States have been suing each other. Of course, there's apparently a trade war even going on between these two of the world's biggest economies in the Asia-Pacific region. On the other hand, the TPP is still proceeding, but on a much smaller scale. At the same time, some have been suggesting at the end of this year, RCEP could be a possibility of reaching a conclusion. Having said that, though, you also see the great transformation of economies looking for structural reforms of their own. So it seems that Australia is at a critical juncture about which road to choose, who to work with, about what. Professor Beeson, I'm sure, as a scholar from Australia working on Asia-Pacific region, you have much deeper thought than just of some of the talking points. Professor, would you like to share with us?
Well, I think one of the interesting things that people are concerned about in Australia and some of the other Western liberal democracies at the moment is about the growing influence of what some people are calling geo-economic power. And I think there's no doubt that China is a major force in the region now. It's everybody's major trade partner, and that's especially true of Australia, of course. So people recognize that China has a great deal of geo-economic leverage, if you like, in the region, and they have to take account of that and take it seriously. And I think the great hope in Australia is that they can encourage China to play a constructive, engaged role in the region and indeed in the world. And I think it's quite striking, and this is potentially good news for China's leadership ambitions, of course. It's quite striking that China is now positioning itself as a champion of globalization in a way that we used to associate with the United States, but the United States seems to have pretty much abandoned that kind of role under the Trump administration, at least, and it opens up an opportunity for China to play a greater leadership role. But there's a big question mark about whether Chinese leadership is prepared to take some of the responsibilities that entails in terms of possible sacrifices in their domestic economy and the role of the renminbi, opening up the domestic market, those kinds of things. So there's a whole series of challenges for China in this as well. So it's not just the smaller countries and economies like Australia that are having to face these big challenges, I think.
Definitely. There are a lot of things that needs to be interacting with one another by all players. Having said that, though, Mr. Tangen, I really love listening to the adjectives Professor Beeson used. That's very selective. For example, he's saying whether China could play a constructive and also engaging role. Of course, there are different interpretations, maybe from the Chinese side, from the Australian side, from the U.S. side, what exactly constructive and engaging mean. Having said that, though, Mr. Tangen, I do want you to come in here as well. When the geopolitics is changing so much, when the rules of the jungle seem to be the priority principle chosen by the largest economy in the world, which is the United States, by saying America first, follow us, listen to us. So will the other economies, Australia included, follow suit? Will that be the picture for the Asia-Pacific region, whether it's about trade, whether it's about geopolitics? What would that mean?
Well, I would point to a contradiction that my colleague, Professor Beeson, just talked about. He said, first, Australia can only survive on a rules-based international multilateral economy. And then he admitted that the U.S. is going in the opposite direction, and China has emerged as the defender of this kind of system. So I think the answer is right there. I mean, even Australia, the U.S.'s closest ally in the Pacific, has this inherent contradiction between what is necessary for them to survive as a country and thrive and what the United States wants them to do in terms of just following its lead for the U.S.'s benefit alone.
Right. Professor Beeson, just to be fair, you want to respond to your colleague briefly?
Well, I think the interesting question is that it's not just an economic imperative that Australian policymakers worry about, and it's you know, to use the cliche, China's rise is a double-edged sword. It's got lots of economic opportunities, but rightly or wrongly, many policy analysts and strategists in Australia also see it as a major threat and a potentially destabilising one in the entire region, and that explains why the Morrison government is going to continue to ramp up spending on security as a direct consequence, I think, of the changing geopolitical environment in the region.
All right. Well, different ways of looking at the things, of course, coming from different players. Having said that, though, we talk about Australian politics. One of the things very unique about Australian politics is none of those prime ministers over the past 30 years could be able to stay as long as their term ends. It's been a revolving door of Australian prime ministers that we have witnessed over the past few decades. In the past decades alone, none of the country's leaders lasted more than 3 years in the office. Let's take a look at this.
Kevin Rudd rose from the ranks of the Labour Party to be Prime Minister after the 2007 elections. His first term ran from December 2007 to June 2010. His second from June to September 2013. Julia Gillard replaced Rudd in 2010 before Rudd ousted her in 2013. After Rudd's second term, Tony Abbott led the Liberal Party to victory in the 2013 elections and was sworn in as the 28th Prime Minister. 2 years later, Malcolm Turnbull resigned from the cabinet to challenge Abbott. He cited polls showing poor opinion of Abbott's leadership. Turnbull was elected Liberal Party leader by 10 votes and replaced Abbott as Prime Minister in September 2015.
Here we go, recent history. Professor Beeson, it was not long ago that Tony Abbott was saying political assassin era is over. Obviously, it has not proved to be true. So, Professor Beeson, why this change over and over again? It takes us a lot of efforts in order to remember the names of the Prime Minister from Australia, Professor Beeson. I hope you could do a better job than I.
It's not a good look for Australia, and I think it's interesting to think about why this is happening. And one of the reasons, I think, is that there are some awfully big egos in the political world, and that's one of the reasons that some people get into this business in the first place. So that's part of it. There's some long-standing animosities between some of the various players that have driven them to enact personal rivalries and feuds over a long period of time, and that's undoubtedly partly what's been going on, particularly with the relationship between Malcolm Turnbull and Tony Abbott. And Abbott's never forgiven Turnbull for overthrowing him and replacing him as Prime Minister. But having said that, you've got to think about the circumstances in which that might even be feasible, and it's partly about the way that the political parties work in Australia, but it's also about the obsessive nature of the news cycle in Australia, the focus on the media, the focus on polling, and the very, very short time frames within which Australian politics is conducted.
Very interesting you mentioned about those factors, but one have to point out those factors seem to be the phenomenon that work in every country, and yet Australia is quite a quote-unquote exceptional in this regard. Mr. Beeson, many argue that it has a lot to do with the ever-decreasing popularity of the two major parties of Australian political system, and sometimes you even see one more seat, a major party existing in Australia, and that certainly has been providing the insecurity of one administration in the office being challenged by the others. And Professor Beeson, briefly respond to that.
Well, there's obviously something in that, but it's not a uniquely Australian phenomenon. If you look around the Western world, where democracies generally are experiencing some major challenges, some difficulties of political legitimacy, and a real question marks about their ability to be able to enact public policy and to respond to the demands of electorates that expect governments to still provide increasing amounts of social welfare and other benefits, while they're finding it difficult to raise sufficient tax revenues because either they're choosing to reduce them or because multinational corporations are able to avoid paying taxes in some cases. So policymakers everywhere are in a very difficult place when trying to enact a good public policy. And Australia is no different. I think what is different about Australia is the way that this is manifest in leadership contests.
I see. But Mr. Tangen, if you look at Australia, the economy is doing very well for more than 25 consecutive years. The economy has been picking up all the time. So one would argue that is perfect for political parties, particularly the major political parties. But obviously, people are looking the other direction. Some been suggesting the moderate parties and some of the alternative parties might be even more attracting attention than some of the major parties that we have witnessed now. But also, if you look at 1983, 2007, three prime ministers, they all stayed their length in terms of their prime ministership. It's only recently. So how should we understand that, Mr. Tangen? And what does it mean for the sustainable policies others could have ever toward Australia?
Well, I think most people see it as a crisis in leadership. I mean, the old ideas, the ideologies that were so clear post-World War II have kind of dissolved after the fall of the Berlin Wall. Nothing is as clear as it is. And as a result, you have leaders who are increasingly, they may say pragmatic. I think they are just pandering. So populism is on the rise. Unfortunately, they don't have a mark where they're saying this is where our country should be. You know, earlier on, we heard the message that the new PM had given. It was not exactly inspiring or staking out new ground for a country that seems to be politically adrift. This idea that the soft underbelly of democracy is showing itself is true, and there has to be some sort of rallying if that is to change.
Well, we'll see how Prime Minister Morrison is doing in his office from now on. But for now, I want to thank our friend coming from down under, Mark Beeson, and certainly from northern China, Peter Tangen. Thank you so much, gentlemen, for being with us, particularly to Professor Benson joining us in the late hours of Australia. Thank you so much. Really appreciate it. And you're watching World Insight with me, Tian Wei. Still to come on our program. The Secretary General of the Arab League talks about member states taking advantage of the Belt and Road Initiative. That exclusive interview right after this break. Welcome back. You're still watching World Insight with me, Tian Wei. The program is coming to you Monday to Friday on CGTN. The peace and the stability of the Arab region has been in the spotlight of the world for decades. Yet despite the turmoil, China has kept historically friendly relations with Arab states. Now it intends to step up collaboration through the Belt and the Road Initiative, or BRI. Earlier, I had an exclusive interview with the Secretary General of the Arab League. He shared with me some of his thoughts about the ongoing in the Arab world when it comes to BRI initiative. Mr. Secretary General, welcome to CGTN. What a pleasure to have you here in Beijing.
Thank you very much for inviting me.
The world is changing fast, as you may know very well, Mr. Secretary General.
Very much so.
A lot of paradigm shift. So what do you make? Where the world is going from the eyes of the Secretary General of the Arab League?
If we are talking globally and not regionally, I would say that the emergence of China and the impressions China is putting on the international map is very obvious, very clear, economically as well as politically. The world needs a country like China, a developing country, but with that industrialized and economic potential to create enough balance.
Belt and Road Initiative, how much that chance would be for the Arab countries?
You see, it is being supported fully by Arab countries because historically the Silk Road has been there between China and Arab Muslim territories towards Mediterranean and Europe. So all you're doing is to renew that effort, and the Arab countries are embracing it, showing great enthusiasm, and I hope that it will be a success, and I'm sure it will be a success. Imagine that a country like Syria lost possibly $600 billion in damage and destruction. And a country like Syria, again, if one tries to rebuild the society as it was, guess what? The cost would be $1 trillion.
That means you have to do your job much harder in a way.
We have first to stabilize Syria. We have to end the civil war. We have to bring a political...
How, the question is?
It is obvious now that we are approaching a point where possibly there will be a permanent ceasefire through the government of President Bashar managing to control the majority of Syrian territory. But the problem there is that he will have to reconcile his differences with the opposition, because if he decides that the opposition is nowhere and that there is no opposition that he should take care of, then he is back to square one, because the end of the insurgency will not stop. It will not stop. You have to accommodate the opposition and the wishes of the Syrian people.
About the Syria issue, of course, this is related to the refugee problem. Some of your states have been shouldering most of the responsibilities, even though they already said very clearly that they cannot anymore, because it's really going to the maximum. Others are still reluctant. So as Secretary General of Arab League, what can you do about that?
First, I have to tell you, there has been those in the West, and that I am very clear of, have been inciting people, rebel against your own governments, show anger against your own governments, and we will support you. The moment such societies erupted and the governments confronted the rebellions, as a consequence of that, hundreds of thousands, if not millions of people started leaving their homes and their territory, their lands. The most humane approach was to accept the refugee in your area and the foreign areas, since you were responsible of pushing them to rebel. You were inciting them, not you in China, but in the Western world. Okay, that happened. What we are trying to do is to convince Arab member states, especially the rich of them, and we have a number of rich Arab countries, to finance operations of hosting the Syrian and the Iraqi and the other refugees. I often visit places in Jordan who is hosting people beyond its capacity, or Lebanon hosting people beyond their capacity, and I see a great effort being done. A school in Beirut is run for children between 8 in the morning till 1 in the afternoon. It is solely Lebanese children in school. then between 1 to 5 and 5:30 to 8:30 or 9, foreign Arab children
I see.
Attending school, the same school with the same staff.
Can you make the other Arab countries to accept refugees besides the one that you just mentioned?
Arab countries do not limit the entry of the refugee. The problem is the refugee is coming to a country that is also under duress, but they tend to go to Turkey and from Turkey to Greece and EU to find job opportunities and facilities for themselves.
What have you learned from that?
It's the Arab countries are reforming themselves, but Arab population came to recognize that foreign intervention is a curse, and that curse has to be aborted, blocked, stopped, and no one should listen to those who feel as if we are advising you for your good. Actually, often advice is for the interest of those who are claiming it. Israel is something else. Israel is Palestine and the Palestinian problem. Due to the situation that has been developing since January 2011 in the Arab area, people have been focused on developments in Libya, in Tunisia, in Iraq, in Syria, in Egypt.
You're so busy.
I have to admit that the Palestinian problem is the core of every interest in trying to pacify that region.
Right.
And not only this, the Palestinian problem is responsible also for triggering all the events. All Arabs are committed to a Palestinian state. All Arabs are committed to East Jerusalem as the capital of the Palestinian state.
What about that now? Because there are so much alternative energies in the world these days. What about the significance of the Arab countries economically on the world map? And as a result of that, politically as well?
Arabs have a monopoly on possibly 60 to 65% of the oil as well as gas, despite the fact that shale oil or Russia as a major producer. But this is the Arab region that holds to 60 to 65% of the strategic reserve. The area is located geographically in what we call the sun belt and the wind belt, and their renewable energy, whether it is winds or solar. I was in Morocco, and I noticed great wind farms. In Egypt, great wind farms. In Emirates and in Saudi Arabia, they rely to a large extent not on oil, though they are major producers of oil, but on solar energy.
Exactly.
So they recognize that even if oil's influence or effect is diminishing over the years, at least they have a replacement in solar as well as wind. Not only we recognize, we maintain the best of relationship with a country like the People's Republic of China. And the Chinese came forward with great projects of coordination, of working together, of cooperation in that particular field you are.
China already imported 150 million tons of oil coming from the Arab countries. That accounts for less than 40% of the country's total import of oil. That's already quite a huge number, as you may know, Mr. Secretary.
Because the Chinese economy is enlarging beyond the rate of growth is going up the ceiling, and but the potential is there. Egypt, for instance, struck great discoveries for gas.
Yes.
And the Eastern Mediterranean harbors lots of opportunities in this regard.
Even though OPEC is the organization that correlates the oil output of countries around the world, but Arab League, as one that is heading an organization where most of the oil-producing states are, what do you think is your role and could be your role? Whether it's about oil, whether it's about renewable, how much of that discussion is going on right now about the choices?
Sustainable energy and sustainable development is being coordinated by the Arab League, and we have certain departments that are bringing every Arab country to meetings to coordinate the policies, to disseminate information to them, because not necessarily all of them are acquainted or in the know of whatever that is taking place in the world. But the problem that is facing the Arab League is the events that have taken place in a number of Arab countries that are very important to the cohesion of the Arab League. Syria was a core country. Iraq went through most difficult times since the American invasion of Iraq 2003. Libya is on the verge of disintegrating. Libya is known to produce at least 1.5 million, or was a few years ago. Today it diminished down to 450,000 barrels a day. That affects the importers. The American pressure on countries not to import Iranian oil, that is again putting stress on the Arab producer.
Once lost the market share, do you think it can be regained in the future, or it is going to be very difficult? Are you worried about that?
In what way?
The market share.
Yes. No, because the moment you reduce your ability and you regenerate enough ability to produce, oil is a commodity that everybody is looking for and running after. So no problem that you lose and you continue to lose. If you lose today a market, tomorrow you will gain it again.
Mr. Secretary General, what a pleasure seeing you. Thank you so much for being with us. All the best,
Thank you
sir.
very much.
And that is all the time we have for today. If you'd like to see more, try to find us World Insight CGTN into your search engine, or check out our YouTube channel. You can also follow us on Twitter, Facebook, and Sina Weibo. From me, Tian Wei, and everyone on the World Insight team, thanks for watching. Tune in again next time for insights across China and around the world. Good night.